Hello there. We are going to have a conversation about the art of the conversation. And I am thrilled to be here with one of my best friends in the entire world. I think officially we were the friend of the 90s, best friend of the 90s to each other. um, uh, and so much of what I've learned about conversation has come from my friend here, Mark Torino. Um, we went to NYU together. We played on the NYU soccer team together, and we made fun of all of our friends on the soccer team together. We made a documentary about those guys. We made a feature about those guys. And we've had about a skillion fascinating conversations about all things, in part also about conversation itself. And I thought that would be a really relevant topic to people in my community. So, Mark, I am so happy you are here. Thank you for coming and having this conversation. Tell them in a more professional sense what you've been up to in your life.
Well, great to be here, Brooks. I teach American literature at the University of Evansville in Southern Indiana, and where I've been for about 16 years. And I'm also a Hemingway scholar. I write books about Hemingway. I've written a few books about Hemingway, and I host One True Podcast, which is a podcast devoted to Hemingway's life, work, and world. So I've been thinking a lot about good conversations over the last 4 or 5 years, especially since the podcast has been born.
Nice. Who? Because so a little more context for Mark and I. So Mark and I used to meet at this restaurant called Eddie's sometimes, and that shut down in New York, but it was there for a little while in the early '90s. And actually, you know what? I remember we were planning to meet there one day, and we went and we saw the doors closed. We're like, oh my goodness, it was the end of an era.
But you were devastated, actually.
You were right?
No, you were not happy at all.
I liked it. It was cheap food. It was like good burritos. They had free popcorn. It was a good spot. But more importantly, Eddie's became an iconic sort of metaphor for us having really good conversations. And you were the first person that I remember in my life that would just ask really good questions. Like I had good friends in high school, a couple of them I'm so friendly with now. But when I got to college and I would hang out with you, you would just ask like a deeper question, not like like something that was too deep, but it just was like, and you were genuinely seemed to be fascinated by what you were, and that led to a whole opening of like, oh, I didn't even know this was like on the table. Like you were allowed to have like really good conversations with just a friend. So tell me, because I know your dad's a journalist and your mom was a writer. So like, did you guys have conversations with your brother that were like unusual, or where did it come from for you?
Definitely not with my brother, but the interesting thing about Eddie's, and I mean, I think that you're hitting on it with how you grow up and having conversations. But so Eddie's was a spot where, okay, so how many restaurants in New York have good food like that? You know, there's probably 10,000 of them.
The food
But
wasn't even that good.
You and I just decided that when we entered that restaurant, that was the zone to sort of communicate. And I know people do that in therapist's office or church. And I know certainly in my classrooms, I hope that when my students enter the classroom, it's like, okay, it's on. And so, yeah, it wouldn't always be like that. I know that you and I, when we'd sit next to each other on the vans on the soccer team in college, it'd be like, oh, we have 45 minutes to travel. Let's get into it. And I wonder how much the surroundings have something to do with it, you know, in terms of just getting your mind in the realm to speak and listen. And in fact, that's the one thing, you know, talking about my mother would listen. And I think she was one of the rare people who would listen to a little kid saying something inane. She was genuinely receptive to that. And I think that was, so I was never surprised when something stupid that was on my mind was being paid attention to. And that was, I didn't realize what a luxury that was.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's great. As you're talking about it now and thinking about some of just recollecting some of those first times you were asking me, it was the type of questions that they would be asking on like a talk show or something. And I'd be like, well, nobody, my friends would never ask me those questions, but you would, it seemed to be coming from a genuine curiosity about the topic and how I would respond to the topic. And so to me, it was beautifully crafted to, and not so much consciously, just you kind of did it. Because you wanted to learn more about it and you wanted to learn my take on it, but you also had a control of, because you got to ask it. Because once I had those conversations with you and then started getting sort of sculpting my own art of conversation, I realized how exciting it is to be able to ask those good questions, because it feels there's a lot of control in it, because you get to go where you want to in the psyche. So was it, do you remember when you first started realizing, like for me, that the Eddie's thing was sort of the beginning of it? Were you already having some good conversations before that, or not necessarily? Did you kind of find it?
I don't remember, but I think in college, when you meet people who are new, you've never met before, different experience, different talents and interests, that probably led to a heightened curiosity. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in high school, my friends and I did really have these penetrating conversations that I don't remember. It all because it seemed natural. If you had told me that you're even telling me this, it felt like we went out to lunch and had a really good conversation or had a good chat. So I certainly wasn't doing anything intentional, or deliberate. It was organic curiosity.
Here's a question for you as a novelist. Mark has actually written my favorite novel of all time that we adapted into a screenplay. But as a novelist, like how do you I'm curious about how you define a novel, and like the experience of reading a novel or writing a novel and reading it, and then in a conversation. What's similar and what's different about those two formats?
Well, I think that a conversation has a reciprocity or a mutual relationship that a movie or a novel or concert has some of it, but not what I look for in a conversation, which is that there's a balance. So if you buy a novel, you're buying a novel, so you're receiving something from that novelist. And of course, you have to participate also in that novel, just like you have to participate in a concert. But a conversation, I think, is more reciprocal, more balanced. So I think that a ratio is probably, doesn't that seem right?
I think so. So if you're talking about a long form story, that's something that, who knows, let's say 1,000 hours were put into from the storyteller's side, and then maybe if it's a novel, 20 hours or 30 hours in reading it. Like that's the ratio. And offhand, maybe it's more or less that. Well, with a movie, you're talking about a 90-minute consumption experience, and again, probably 1,000 hours of creation, or who knows. And with conversation, we're sort of creating and listening. It's not that sort of lopsided thing, which I think lends itself to, like, I remember you introduced me to Bob Dylan, and I was just like, what's that scratchy voice? Like, who would like that guy? Can't even sing. You're like, you're kidding. You're like, this guy's amazing. And so I slowly learned to really see how you were absolutely right, that he was fascinating. And then I remember at one point early on, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if like he was at Eddie's with us? And you're like, no, I'm not. I was like, what? This guy, you love this guy, you love his lyrics, all those things. He's obviously fascinated in things that you and I are both fascinated by, but you were like, no, I'm good with that relationship I have with Bob already. Like, like him being a musician and knowing his lyrics. It's a different thing with him being at Eddie's. And you were like, at least in that moment, not the least bit interested. And that was fascinating to me.
And then soon after, this actually happened when Paul Simon was at the diner.
That's right.
And you love Paul Simon, and Paul Simon is fantastic. And we found Paul Simon at the diner. So our theoretical discussion became an actuality. And do you remember what happened when Paul Simon was there? Like, what did you want to say to Paul Simon? What would have been the ideal? But remember what actually happened.
Yeah, it's funny. I'd forgotten that, but so I remember, yeah, because you and I also, yeah, we're big Paul Simon fans, and both Dylan and Simon really great lyricists, and so I remember that was at that diner in Hell's Kitchen, and he comes in, and I think I saw him first. I was like, dude, that was Paul Simon, and he kind of you were like, no. I was like, yeah, it's him, and then but he kind of like slouched in. It seemed like he was after a recording session with a couple guys he was playing, and he, I'm sure Dylan too, but notoriously, like, he was not like, hey, come talk to me about intellectual conversations. He just was like wanting to get an omelet and get the hell out of there. So my recollection of it was you and I going, oh my God, that's Paul Simon. But not at all thinking that there was like, hey, let's go talk to him. Like, there was nothing in that moment that we had to offer to him, even though theoretically, I'm sure the three of us could actually have a really interesting conversation. But in that place, it just didn't seem. So I think we probably talked about what we would talk to him about, and then didn't at all bother him, right? I mean, is that what happened?
Exactly. And so he was giving off like pheromones, like, don't don't
blinking sign, get the F away from me.
No doubt about it. And I remember the closest we came, because we were scheming on how to penetrate that, how to cross that divide. And I said that I think our best bet would have been to be like, this salt shaker is out of salt. Could we borrow your salt shaker? This place never refills the salt. Like to stat, like, if we were co-diners, maybe he would have been receptive to that. But as like, oh, I'm a big fan, Graceland is a great out, like, could you sing me and Julio down? Like, none of that would have flown at that moment. But to engage with him as a diner, that would have helped.
Well,
but we didn't do it.
Yeah, no, we didn't do it, and I think that was the right choice. That would have been certainly a gateway potential escalation of the relationship from strangers to whatever. But like, in an alternate universe, you, me, and Paul were like high-fiving and having great conversations, but like that wasn't our universe, and certainly not the one he was in. But I bet you our conversation was better than their conversation.
They didn't look like they were having a great time. Brooks, can I ask you something about the art of conversation that I've been thinking about over the last couple of years? And that is, because this surprised me, and this is all about preparing for a podcast. So in the first couple dozen episodes, we did the interview, and some of them were great and some of them were not so great. And I was wondering why, what differentiates the really good ones from the not so good ones. And I came to the conclusion that sending the guest a loose outline of 8 to 10 to 12 points that I wanted to cover over the hour interview was going to clarify my objectives in a conversation. And believe it or not, I can't say all the episodes have been phenomenal, but it has really it's raised the basement so that even the less successful episodes are better than previously. And that's because they kind of either consciously or subconsciously can prepare for what I want to talk about. So if I invited you out for coffee, even though we've known each other for a very long time, and I said, hey, Brooks, here's 4 things I want to talk about. If you send me 4 things, we can knock off those 8 talking points. Like, would that be a turnoff, or would you think that would be enjoyable?
I think it's actually a really good idea. There's a conversation I had with a friend recently that was similar to it, where it was sort of like, it's like how you structure an experience, right? And if you're talking about a conversation, you just want to, like Larry King famously wouldn't do any sort of research or whatever, and he would just go as, and you can do it that way, and you can trust your instinct to meander, and that's fine. But I think you're right. I think actually anchoring it around a few topics can structure it in a way, as long as there's a looseness. It's sort of like famously, Spielberg would talk about how he'd storyboard everything and then kind of throw them out and just kind of instinctively go, where do I want to see what's going on here? And then ultimately decide where he puts the camera on the set. So I think I like that. I like that balance of structure and fluidity for, the magic, because the magic, even if we said these 4 topics, but like all of a sudden something sparks, we want to be able to run with that spark. But I like having that baseline, like, okay, if things aren't clicking, at least you're going to cover these things and you're going to have good things. Interestingly, we did not do that for this conversation.
We trusted it. We this is jazz,
It's not our first rodeo either to have a couple conversations. So here's a question for you. Top 3 interviewers of all time, and I'm putting you on the spot. I didn't give you the word. Off the top of your head, when you think about people who ask really good questions, and to me, I think one sign of that is like it almost the guest matters less because the interviewer is so good. Like, who would you put in that category, top of mind, and why? Top 3.
So, really good interviewer is Howard Stern, and it's really. I would rather listen. Howard Stern can make an uninteresting person interesting more easily than a mediocre or even a decent interviewer can make an interesting person interesting. He's excellent. I mean, he takes, he can be with an A-lister or, some insane person from his, staff, and he can make it compelling. So I think that he understands what is, the question, like, oh yeah, I hope he asks this question, or I would never have thought to ask that. So I think Howard Stern is really, if you take away, and I have to also confess, I haven't listened to him in the last few years. I have no way of listening to him, but when I did listen to him, I always felt his interviews were gripping. I felt they were really, really good.
One interesting thing, I love that. I think he's a great choice, and it reminds me of a conversation we had once about him. Remember this? The way he would read back when he was on the terrestrial radio, the way he would read the advertisements, he would do it with this giddiness, and he was obviously not. He'd be like, "This pasta, oh my God, it's the best pasta ever! It cooks up al dente every time." And you knew he didn't believe any of it, but he would do it with such showmanship and playfulness. And totally like embracing, I'm just going to totally, it was a really interesting energy. And I think it's similar to what he's basically saying, I'm going to bring everything I have to this moment, my curiosity, my daring. And I think you're right. And that way, even the most not, sort of quote, boring person, he could have a fascinating conversation with, because he's going to bring them to a place that's like, oof, it's a little bit saucy. Great great one. Do you want to mention 2 more or?
So there's a guy that I listen to. I don't know his name. He's on a podcast, a news podcast that I listen to all the time from the New York Times. And there's a problem with this guy. He's really smart, but he knows the topic so well that he knows it about as well as the reporter who he's questioning. So he's almost like a prosecutor, or he's got like a witness up on the stand, so he's guiding them through what he wants. And I don't like that. That doesn't allow for the magic that we were talking about. So there's no surprise in those interviews. So I don't know the guy's name, and I know that's not part of the top 3, but it's a quality that I love in interviewers, where you can be informed. Frankly, I think the Larry King way of doing it is just lazy. Like, you didn't see the movie? Really? Okay. You didn't flip through the book? No. But you have to have a little, like we were saying about sending talking points, is having a little elasticity, a little nimbleness in the conversation. So I guess it's like there's like a sweet spot of having a person who's informed but still looking to learn. right? Still curious about the topic. So I think that's kind of interesting. Do any names come to mind to you about a really good interviewer?
I have three
Bring it.
that come to mind. Yeah. So I think my favorite of all time was Charlie Rose, and I know he got canceled, and I know he did some things that were but putting that stuff aside, I feel chills even thinking about it. His show, and he would say, such and such is here to talk about their work as, a director or whatever. And I'm pleased to have them back at this table. I loved it. So there, it actually reminded me some of the energy of our conversations where he just really wanted to get into what made them tick and what was great about their process. And he had a warmth and a charm and a non-judgmental sort of quality. I mean, some people complain that he talked a bit too much, but I really loved the energy of his interviews.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Brooks, there's something on this topic. I don't want to cut you off before you say number 3, but I was just reading a newspaper article today, and this was not knowing that this was going to come up in our conversation, but there's a sideline reporter in the NFL. You know how they'll interview a coach for maybe 12 seconds as they go. And she just confessed to making up interviews. So she would say something like, yeah, I talked to the Coach Jenkins, and he really thinks that they really need to fire up the team in the fourth quarter, and they think they can stop. So in other words, she knew the cliches that the coach would say, so she didn't even bother talking to him because she knew what he was going to say. And what she just did was lift up the rock and expose what a useless exercise it is of these in-game interviews with coaches. That's the absolute opposite. If all you want to do is fill up 90 seconds of airtime, you're not listening. That guy doesn't care what he says. You don't care what he says. What he said this week is exactly the same as it's awful. That's why it's such a waste of time.
I love that observation. It is an interesting thing in terms of that broadcast, and they do it. Yeah, they do it in fights, do whatever, and it's weird because they've got like their whole job in the broadcast is like 1 or 2 questions. It's a weird thing. It's strange that they do it, and that's funny. You confess. Okay, I actually have 2 others.
Bring it.
One of them we've talked about a lot is James Lipton from Inside the Actor Studio, and what I think is amazing about him is, I mean, he's so over the top, gushing about people, but like there's and that aside, his research is huge. He prides himself in finding some little gem or talking to some obscure person and going, in 2nd grade, your teacher said such and such. He's like, how'd you know? And you could see him like smiling, like he lived for that moment. But there was something about him, that dramatic actor that he was, like just totally embracing being his style of interviewer and just shining so much love on them. And, and he was preposterous and whatever. I got to put my cat up in the window. Yes. But anyway, so I really liked him in terms of finding his own style and showering love on his people. That I really liked him. And you and I have had lots of jokes about him. And then
he put his guests at ease also. Like Howard Stern's guests are simultaneously on edge because you never know where he's going to go, but he also gets stuff out of them. And Lipton, I think, had a lot of trust, and certainly some of the things that those guests revealed, I remember for years and years later. So I think that's totally solid.
Yeah. There was one clip I saw where he asked Spielberg something about Close Encounters, and he basically got Spielberg to connect an insight about his parents in Close Encounters, and Spielberg was like, I never thought about that. It was pretty awesome. And again, you can see the pride there. The third one I have is Joe Rogan. And the reason I like him, and I know that there's some people politically that aren't crazy about him, but one of the things I like about him is that he's open to that free form. I happen to be a really big, UFC fan, so I've always liked his commentating there. I like comics in the world of comics, and he's that's a big part of his life. But I feel like he gets in there and he does it in his own style, and he's got a wide range of guests. Like, I'm interested in this person and I want to go in there. So I like his interviewing style a lot. It's interesting to me that he's probably the most popular podcaster on the planet because it's so sort of like, yeah, I'm interested in this and this and that. And it seems disparate, but like, he really has found a way to be just, and I think there's a genuineness about him and his curiosity that I think is really interesting for that format. So, I know you haven't actually seen the show, have you?
No, I should, and I will, but I can't, I don't have any insight into him, but some of the qualities that you're just saying, I mean, you apply them to how we started the conversation, which is at Eddie's, which is just, openness, mutual curiosity, willing to go different places. Those elements, I think, aren't just podcasting tools, but also just tools for human interaction.
Yeah. All right. So here's how we're gonna conclude today, my friend. Let's talk about your definition of a good conversation. We chatted about this informally when we talked about maybe doing this interview, and I really loved the way you defined it. And you can use that same definition before or come up with a new one if you want. But how, Mark, would you define a good conversation?
Can you remind me of my exact definition, and I'll see if it's changed since I think. Go ahead.
What you said, or what I remember you said was, it's a good conversation when you're really excited to hear what the other person is going to say next.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah,
I think that is true. Is when you're really curious about listening to the perspective of the person you're in a conversation with. And the balance is such that that other person doesn't say, wow, I really had to carry that conversation, So it feels like a mutual thing, but I would never leave a conversation going, yeah, I really dominated that one. I got like 80% of the words in. So I definitely, I'm definitely trounced Brooks in that conversation. So yeah, there's that. When you're listening a lot and it doesn't feel like you don't have the liberty to cut in or to enter the conversation if you want to. It plays out exactly the way you're supposed to play it. Like whatever instrument you're playing in the band is exactly the part that you want to play, and the other person is doing it to make the song the best, not the individual band member shine the most.
The way you spoke to it there reminds me of a beautiful articulation you had about two characters in your book. That one was a bartender and one was a guy spending too much time in that bar.
Right.
And you said, I was like, how did you write that relationship? Because the dynamic was really beautiful. Because the guy that was spending too much time in the bar was just at a very like wounded place in his life, really deeply questioning a lot of things. And you said it was like these puzzle pieces that were like perfect for each other. I thought it was such a beautiful, poetic way to describe a relationship. And in you talking about your definition of a great conversation now, it feels like that. Like when I'm in the best conversations of my life, it feels like beautifully interlocking puzzle pieces, whether I'm speaking or listening or asking the questions or answering the questions. There's a I was going to use a word, but it's not a good word. But there's just a harmony to it and a dance to it that I think is and there's a flow state that happens, and there's an ease and a fascination. It's like a mutual exploration of both psyches at the same time.
It's been interesting, Brooks, because when I edit my episodes, I literally can visualize how much I'm talking and how much the guest is talking. So if there's a big cluster by my file, I get nervous that I'm not, giving the guest enough respect. And I think the part that I hate the most about my own performance as an interviewer is when I try to cut off the guest and the guest keeps talking, so the sound is like, and that's me doing that. And so I make that silent, because to me that's such an ugly sound. It's like, yeah, I know you're talking, but I'm going to talk anyway. And I know it's probably living in New York and New Jersey for most of my life, that's just how you have a conversation. But I find it like really grating to hear me try to cut through somebody else's speech. And in a podcast, and I'm sure in real life, it's not much more pleasant,
Well, that reminds me of a thing I heard from, I think it was just a life coach or something, but she said at the extreme that she like never interrupts, like zero, never. And she felt like every interruption is murdering the thought process of the person that you're with.
Yeah. Like if you ever listen to a jazz improv, it's so, like, the best is like there'll be one guy soloing for a couple of minutes, and then the other guy will, like, it won't be silent in between them. The other guy will do a couple spurts, and then to just be like, hey, I'm about to start, and then the guy will continue. And that never seems rude, because it seems like that's how you pass the mic, you do it that way. But yeah, for sure, I think Benjamin Franklin wrote about Native American traditions, and there was, like, when he was speaking with a Native American leader, Benjamin Franklin would say something, and the Native American guy would be silent for like a minute.
Ooh, wow.
And Benjamin Franklin's like, why are you not talking? He goes, I'm thinking about what you're saying. Like, that guy would get buried in eddies if he was just silent for a minute, right? No, but that's waving off the, it's like saying, I need to, it's actually a really honest, it's probably healthy to think along those lines of, like, that's respectful to say, I'm going to digest what you've given me, rather than, okay, you're done talking. Okay, what now? Here I go.
Yeah. I love that. That's a really interesting thing. And it's an awareness of a trust of the deeper thoughts, as opposed to the chattering thoughts up top, which are like the ones you're like, when's this person going to stop so I can get into these thoughts?
Right.
Blah, 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 blah. But if I'm really holding space and listening, and even when they finish, I let that sift through and sort and think.
Deeper,
it's gonna be deeper conversation.
Does this relate, Brooks? I mean, I know that when you work with actors, they always say, "Oh, acting, listening is essential," and that kind of thing. Is this related is the way you listen in a conversation and the way you would listen on stage or on a screen, is it related or identical?
It's a great question. So it absolutely is, because it's really about being in the moment. There's an acting technique called Meisner, where they do this exercise where they literally go, I see your blue shirt. And then you say to me, I see your blue shirt. Like, that's the line of dialogue, but we're in the moment saying that back and forth to each other just to practice. So we're not caught up in the lines or whatever. We're literally just playing the subtext underneath that line in the moment, staying in the moment. And so all great performances are doing that. They are in the moment, and that's what makes them feel electric and alive, even though everything's already planned. So, and that's what good acting and good performances are. They're recreations of conversations.
That's true.
Yeah. So the being in the moment is absolutely part of a deeper experience of life, and certainly a quality of great conversation if you're going to master the art of the conversation.
Someday
All
we
right,
will.
that's
Brooks.
great. Yeah, that's I think that's a wonderful ending point. Any last thoughts you want to share, my friend?
It's always great to have a great conversation with you, Brooks. I hope this is not the last. I hope we have sequels to this. This would be magnificent. We were right. This is Eddie's, just minus a burrito and free bowl of popcorn at the beginning. Paul Simon.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Mark. Really good to see you.
Pleasure.
This, and it was a lot of fun to have this. Until the next time.
Anytime.